Welcome to True Crime Talks, where we dive into chilling real-life stories of betrayal, deceit, and murder. In today's case, a marriage built on lies ends in tragedy. This is the story of Marriage for Immigration, Benefits Ends in Murder. In a bustling neighborhood of Chicago, Emma Collins, a 34-year-old nurse, was looking for a fresh start after a difficult divorce. She poured herself into her work and kept her social life minimal, but loneliness lingered. Everything changed when she met Carlos Rivera at a friend's dinner party. He was a 27-year-old student from Argentina, full of charm and captivating stories of his dreams in America. His warm smile and captivating accent drew Emma in, and before long they found themselves in a whirlwind romance. Carlos had moved to the United States with grand ambitions, but was now facing a harsh reality. His student visa was set to expire in a matter of months. The looming deadline weighed heavily on him, and he confided his fears to Emma. She sympathized with his situation, finding his vulnerability endearing. As their bond deepened, Carlos proposed a solution: they should marry. While their connection felt real to Emma, the idea of such a significant step so soon sparked hesitation. However, her longing for companionship and Carlos's seemingly genuine affection melted away her doubts. Despite warnings from friends and family about moving too quickly, Emma dismissed their concerns. She believed love wasn't always about timing, but about taking chances. Convinced that Carlos's intentions were pure, she agreed to marry him. A modest wedding took place at a local courthouse, with only a few close friends present. Emma felt hopeful as they exchanged vows, imagining a future filled with love and adventure. In the early days of their marriage, life seemed idyllic. They shared romantic evenings in their small apartment, cooked meals together, and made plans for a shared future. Carlos talked about pursuing permanent residency and starting a career in architecture, while Emma dreamed of a stable life with a loving partner by her side. However, as the months passed, subtle shifts in Carlos's behavior began to unsettle Emma. His warmth started to wane, replaced by a growing distance she couldn't explain. He spent more and more time away from home, often giving vague reasons about work and networking events. Emma tried to rationalize his absences, thinking he was merely busy building his career. Soon, she noticed financial decisions being made without her knowledge. Carlos withdrew significant amounts from their joint bank account, always offering excuses that didn't quite add up. A gnawing sense of unease took hold of Emma, but she told herself it was just the natural adjustment of married life. After all, every marriage faced. Despite her efforts to brush aside her concerns, Emma couldn't shake the growing feeling that something was amiss. Late one night, she noticed Carlos texting someone with a secrecy that raised her suspicions. When she casually asked about it, he claimed it was a colleague, brushing her off with a quick kiss. Emma began keeping her worries to herself, too embarrassed to share them with the friends who had cautioned her. She told herself to trust her husband, clinging to the belief that love would prevail. Yet her instincts whispered that there was more to the story than Carlos let on. The cracks in their marriage, once subtle, had now grown too large to ignore. Emma was left wondering if she had mistaken infatuation for love, and whether the man she had married was ever truly the person she believed him to be. In her heart, she feared she had given everything to someone who had never intended to stay. As Emma grew more unsettled by the changes in her marriage, Carlos focused on solidifying his immigration status. His charm and resourcefulness had always been his greatest strengths, and he used them to full effect in crafting a life that would appear picture-perfect to immigration officials. He meticulously kept a collection of photos from their outings, anniversary cards, and social media posts that painted a convincing portrait of a happy couple. Every detail was calculated to show that their union was real, even as the emotional connection between them began to crumble. Behind Emma's back, Carlos maintained a secret correspondence with Sofia, the woman he had left behind in Argentina. They had shared dreams of building a life together in America, and she eagerly awaited the day he could return to her. His messages to Sofia were filled with promises of a bright future once he secured his residency. He spoke of his marriage as a necessary transaction, a temporary obstacle on the path to the life they had always planned. He reassured her that Emma meant nothing to him, just a means to an end. One evening, as Emma sat alone in their apartment, she stumbled upon a conversation between Carlos and Sofia on his laptop. The affectionate language and intimate promises made her heart pound. Her worst fears had been confirmed. Overwhelmed with anger and betrayal, she felt the walls of her carefully constructed life collapsing around her. Memories of their early romance replayed in her mind, each one now stained with the knowledge of his deception. Confronted with the truth, Emma's mind raced with questions. Why had she ignored the signs? How could she have been so blind to his intentions? Desperate for answers, she confronted Carlos when he came home later that night. Her hands trembled as she demanded an explanation. He dismissed her accusations with a disarming calmness, claiming Sofia was merely an old friend from his past. His smooth words and dismissive attitude only deepened her suspicion. Unable to trust him any longer, Emma confided in her best friend, Olivia, revealing everything she had discovered. Olivia had been skeptical of Carlos from the start, and her fears now seemed validated. She urged Emma to take immediate action, warning that a man who had lied about love could be capable of far worse. Though Emma agreed, fear held her back. If she exposed Carlos, she risked facing questions from immigration officials herself. Would they believe she had been complicit in a fraudulent marriage? The shame and uncertainty weighed heavily on her. Emma decided to take careful, deliberate steps. She began gathering evidence of her own, keeping a journal of suspicious incidents and documenting her conversations with Carlos. She photographed the messages from Sofia and noted every time he left the house without explanation. Her resolve strengthened with each discovery, but a growing sense of dread followed her every move. Carlos, meanwhile, sensed her distance but believed his charm would keep her in line. He underestimated her determination. As Emma's investigation into his double life deepened, the love she once felt for him turned into a cold, unshakable resentment. She knew she could no longer ignore the truth. The man she had married for love had used her for his own gain, and her heart ached with the realization that her marriage had been a carefully orchestrated lie. The stakes had never been higher, and Emma felt like a pawn in a dangerous game. She was determined to break free, but she had no idea just how far Carlos would go to protect his secret. As Emma's suspicions grew, her once warm and inviting home felt increasingly like a prison. The air seemed heavier, charged with the tension of secrets and lies. Carlos's behavior, once subtle in its deceit, became more pronounced and troubling. He frequently disappeared without explanation, leaving Emma alone in the empty apartment, staring at the walls and wondering where he was. His once charming demeanor now felt calculated and cold, a mask he wore to maintain control. Emma could no longer ignore the gnawing feeling that danger was lurking just beneath the surface of their relationship. Every glance, every movement Carlos made seemed to carry a hidden threat. He had taken complete control of their finances, withdrawing large sums of money from their joint bank account without consulting her. When questioned, he offered only vague excuses about needing it for investment opportunities or business ventures. Emma's questions were met with irritation, his tone growing sharper with each confrontation. The fragile trust between them shattered completely when Emma overheard a late-night phone call. Carlos's hushed voice carried through the thin walls of their bedroom. She pressed her ear to the door and caught fragments of the conversation. He spoke of leaving, of making final arrangements, and his words were laced with urgency and fear. Though she couldn't hear the full details, one thing was clear: he was preparing to abandon her. Emma's fear now turned into panic. She knew she had little time to act, but she was paralyzed by indecision. Reporting Carlos to immigration authorities felt like her only option, but it would expose her to scrutiny as well. Her mind raced with worst-case scenarios: deportation hearings, legal battles, and public humiliation. Yet, doing nothing felt even more dangerous. Determined to protect herself, she sought out a lawyer specializing in immigration law. Emma explained the situation in detail, from the whirlwind romance to the discovery of Carlos's betrayal. The lawyer listened carefully and laid out her options. An annulment would be possible, but it would require substantial evidence of fraud. Reporting her husband's deceit could jeopardize her own legal standing if investigators believed she had knowingly participated in the scheme. Despite the risks, Emma knew she had to act. She began compiling everything she had: the messages between Carlos and Sofia, financial records showing his unexplained withdrawals, and a written account of his threatening behavior. She felt a flicker of hope that justice could be served, but fear shadowed her every move. She kept her preparations secret, living in constant vigilance. Carlos, meanwhile, grew increasingly erratic. He sensed Emma's withdrawal and the subtle changes in her behavior. He noticed how her eyes followed him more closely, how she avoided physical contact, and how she locked her phone away as if guarding her thoughts. His calm facade began to crack, replaced by bursts of temper and thinly veiled threats. When he discovered the email correspondence between Emma and her lawyer, his panic turned to rage. He realized that she was building a case against him, a case that could destroy everything he had worked for. In his mind, the stakes were now life or death. Emma was no longer just an obstacle. She was a threat that had to be eliminated. The once romantic partnership had transformed into a terrifying power struggle. Emma, driven by fear and a fierce will to survive, prepared for the worst. But she underestimated the depth of Carlos's desperation and the lengths he would go to protect himself. What had begun as a marriage for opportunity had now spiraled into a nightmare with deadly consequences waiting in the shadows. On a cold February night, the tension in Emma's apartment reached a breaking point. The usual silence between her and Carlos had deepened, and neither could ignore the growing animosity. Emma had been gathering evidence of Carlos's betrayal, documenting his suspicious behavior, and preparing to take action. Her heart raced as she watched him, wondering how much longer she could continue living in this web of lies. She had hoped the truth would set her free, but it only seemed to trap her deeper. That night, as Emma sat alone in the living room, she heard Carlos's footsteps approaching the front door. He had been out for hours, and she knew something wasn't right. The door slammed open, and Carlos entered, his eyes cold and his face hardened with determination. He didn't speak a word, but Emma could feel the tension in the air. His presence felt like a storm waiting to unleash. The argument began without warning. Carlos accused Emma of being paranoid, of trying to ruin everything he had worked for. He was furious, his voice rising with each passing moment. Emma tried to keep her composure, her mind racing with thoughts of escape, but Carlos's words cut deep. He shouted at her, claiming that he had done everything for her and that she would never understand the sacrifices he had made. Emma stood her ground, refusing to back down. The argument spiraled into chaos. Carlos's anger, which had been building for months, finally erupted. He slammed his fist against the wall, causing the room to shake. Emma recoiled, fear gripping her chest. In that moment, she realized just how dangerous he had become. The man she had once trusted was now a stranger, a man capable of anything to protect his secret. At some point during the heated exchange, Carlos stopped speaking. He turned away from her and began pacing, his breathing heavy. Emma could feel the weight of the moment, the air thick with a sense of impending doom. She had never seen him like this before, his eyes filled with something far darker than anger. Then, without warning, Carlos lunged at her. He grabbed her by the arms and shook her violently. Emma's breath caught in her throat as she struggled to break free from his grip. The force of his hands felt like a vice, and she feared for her life. She had never imagined he could hurt her like this. In a frantic effort to escape, Emma pushed Carlos away, but he wasn't done. His face twisted with rage as he stormed into the kitchen. Emma's mind raced. She had to get away. She backed toward the door, her thoughts frantic as she reached for her phone to call for help. But before she could make a move, Carlos reappeared, this time holding a heavy object in his hand. It was a moment that seemed to stretch on forever. Carlos raised the object, and in one swift motion, he struck Emma across the head. The impact was immediate and brutal. The world around her spun as she collapsed to the floor, her vision blurring. Pain radiated through her body, but her mind was still alert, still aware of the danger that surrounded her. Carlos stood over her, breathing heavily, his expression one of shock and disbelief. For a moment, Emma thought he might come to his senses, that maybe this was all just a terrible mistake. But the coldness in his eyes told her otherwise. This wasn't a mistake. It was a calculated move to silence her. As Emma lay on the floor, blood seeping from the wound on her head, she realized that she was no longer just a victim of deceit. She had become a pawn in a deadly game, a game Carlos had been playing all along. The man she had trusted, the man she had married, was now her greatest threat. With Carlos standing over her, Emma's world went black, and in that darkness, the truth became undeniable. She was no longer just fighting for her marriage. She was fighting for her life. The following morning, the quiet of the apartment was broken by the discovery of Emma's lifeless body. Neighbors had heard the argument the previous night but hadn't thought much of it, assuming it was just another marital dispute. It wasn't until hours later that one of them noticed Carlos leaving the building with a large suitcase. His hurried exit was strange, but no one had suspected anything sinister at the time. When Emma's friends couldn't reach her and went to check on her, they found the door ajar, and inside the brutal scene unfolded. The police were called immediately. The scene was chaotic, but the detectives wasted no time. Emma's body was found in the living room, showing clear signs of blunt force trauma. It didn't take long for them to piece together the facts. Carlos Rivera was missing, and Emma had been murdered. The evidence pointed to him as the prime suspect. Witnesses from the building provided crucial details about Carlos's behavior in the days leading up to the murder. He had been distant, withdrawn, and on edge, a stark contrast to the man they had once known. Neighbors also mentioned that they had seen him with a large suitcase the night of the murder, heading toward the bus station. Surveillance footage confirmed this, and the police quickly learned that he had boarded a bus heading toward Texas. While the investigation began to gather momentum, Emma's friends and family were left reeling. Olivia, Emma's best friend, immediately knew that something had gone terribly wrong. She remembered all the times Emma had confided in her, telling her about the strange behavior of her husband, the increasing distance between them, and the fears that Carlos was not who he seemed to be. Olivia had always suspected that something was off, but never in her worst nightmares did she imagine it would end in murder. As investigators continued to dig into Carlos's background, they discovered a disturbing pattern. Carlos had been involved in multiple fraudulent marriages before, all designed to help him secure immigration benefits. His connections with Sofia in Argentina had been long-standing, and it became clear that Emma had merely been a stepping stone in his grand plan to gain residency in the United States. Emma's discovery of the affair and Carlos's manipulation had sealed her fate. He realized that she was a threat to his carefully constructed life, and in a fit of panic and rage, he had taken matters into his own hands. The breakthrough in the case came when Border Patrol officers apprehended Carlos trying to cross into Mexico. He had tried to flee, but the law caught up with him before he could escape. During his interrogation, Carlos confessed to the murder, but his explanation was chillingly devoid of remorse. He claimed that Emma had become a liability, and her discovery of his plans had forced him to act. He described the murder as a necessary evil, a desperate move to protect his future. The investigation revealed even more damning evidence. Emails between Carlos and Sofia were uncovered, detailing plans for a life together once he secured his green card. Sofia had been completely unaware of Carlos's marriage to Emma, and when she learned the truth, she was horrified. She cooperated fully with authorities, providing a clear picture of Carlos's deceitful behavior. Carlos's trial was swift, and the evidence stacked against him was overwhelming. The jury found him guilty of first-degree murder, and he was sentenced to life in prison without the possibility of parole. His dream of a new life in America was shattered, and he would spend the rest of his days paying for the life he had stolen from Emma. In the wake of the tragedy, Emma's family and friends struggled to come to terms with her death. Her loved ones rallied together to create a foundation in her memory, aimed at supporting victims of domestic abuse and fraud. Emma's tragic end served as a powerful reminder of how easily trust can be shattered, and how far some people will go to protect their own interests. While Emma's life had been cut short, her legacy lived on in the work of the foundation, helping others who found themselves in similar situations. Her story was a cautionary tale about the dangers of deceit, manipulation, and the lengths some will go to in pursuit of their own desires. For Emma, the story ended in violence, but for many others, her memory would continue to inspire change and support.